On today's Huddle Up with Gus, we have one of America's top sports writers and leading experts on the golden age of boxing, an author of several books and a longtime senior writer for the Philadelphia Daily News, the son of legendary Sports Illustrated writer Mark Kram. Please welcome into the Huddle, Mark Kram Jr.
Dave, in the Huddle today is Mark Kram Jr., just an author of a really great book out this year about Joe Frazier. Mark was for many years in Philadelphia. You told me the numbers there.
25 years or something.
Yeah. So it's just an incredible sports writer. Has many stories, and I'm so excited to interview our second author now that we've had on our show and our podcast.
Oh, me too. And especially like Mark's sweet spot is early 70s boxing, that's pretty much.
Yeah. Dave and I are big sports fans. So Mark, welcome to the show. Thank you for getting in the Huddle with us today.
Sure. Great to meet you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so Dave and I really wanted to start our show because we've listened to many sports talk shows and we just got really tired of the same old thing. And we thought we could do it a little different. So
sure, yeah.
We start with all of our guests and we want to find out when you were a kid, at what age or what time, who was that influence, or was that person, was it an idol, or was it a team that really made that spark of sports being important in your life?
Well, my father was a featured writer at Sports Illustrated during the golden age of sports writing in the 60s and 70s. He was a contemporary of all the names you've heard of, Dan Jenkins, Frank DeFord, and many others. He was the lead boxing writer in the 60s and early 70s, and his name was Mark Kram, and covered Ali and Frazier, all the big three fights. And so if anything sparked me, it was that. He would always come home and sort of give me the inside dope on what was going on in the camps and, what he saw and heard. And it sort of brought it alive. And also he would come home and he would all have the New York papers in his bag. And I just dove into his travel bag and got all the papers, the Post and the Daily News. And, I didn't see that. We lived in Baltimore, so I didn't see it on a regular basis. So I just loved that. And, he was very busy. He traveled the world. But when I did see him, he was my link to, the career I would have and, the interest that I would hold in sports.
So, growing up in Baltimore, were you an Orioles fan, Colts fan, and all that? Yeah.
Huge Oriole fan. I went to as many games as I could. Spent all my spare money on tickets to go to the Oriole games. And, I reflect back on it, those teams. And so what did I get out of watching them play? And they really showed you, win or lose, what greatness looked like, what achievement looked like. And, no one was more heartbroken when they lost than I. But even then, I seemed to hold it in some perspective. They really tried their best. They were great athletes, and they were good guys. I don't think I've met a man in this world who was a better guy than Brooks Robinson.
Yeah.
And these were guys you'd see around town at that time. You'd see them at the shopping mall or at the gas station. Or I had a friend who was picked up hitchhiking on New York Road by Johnny Unitas, of all things. That was the kind of culture that we had back then.
Right.
And, the Orioles, the Colts, but particularly the Orioles, they were my guys.
So if you were out, young Mark Kram, he's on the corner, you're playing wiffle ball with all your buddies.
Yeah.
Who were you? Were you Brooks Robinson? Was that your favorite player?
Well, I mainly played basketball on the playgrounds. I didn't play much sandlot baseball. Basketball, that was when Earl Monroe came into Baltimore in the late 60s and early 70s, so everybody was Earl. And the guys that, just shot the ball, they were Kevin Lockery. So, just gunners, and they were an exciting team. We were going nose to nose with the New York teams every season, it seemed like, and we were getting our heads handed to us. The Mets, the Jets, the the Knicks, and it was just an exciting time to be a young sports fan. So yeah, Earl Monroe, and I sort of modeled myself after some of the bench warmers, actually.
So you're growing up. Did you play a lot of organized sports? Like a lot of us played a lot of backyard stuff back in the day.
Sure.
We all would just ride our bikes, get our friends, use your imagination. There's the out of bounds, all that stuff. And it's more organized today. What
Sure.
organized sports did you play growing up?
Well, I played baseball, little league, and pony league, and those sorts of things. I played high school baseball and high school basketball, but I was second team. But I practiced hard every day, and I went to I took sports as far as my abilities could take me, and like for everyone, it was frustrating when I couldn't take me any further. But you learn a lot from sticking with sport. Sports teaches you how to stick with something and to fight through adversity. I really do think it's important for kids to learn those lessons. And Gus, really, what you come away from playing sports at a young age is you have dreams of being a pro. Not everybody can be that. Few can be that. But you take away with it lessons you'll apply to all sorts, whatever you do in life. I really do believe that. So.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And so many of our guests have said that when they were young, they learned so many lessons from sports of getting knocked down, getting back up, and being resilient and doing the things that carry you on through life. For myself, I broke my neck in 9th grade and went through a lot of stuff, being bullied in school because I'm wearing a neck brace for 9 weeks and all those things. And then I have something happen to me in the NFL that was probably one of the most embarrassing moments any player could ever have. And it let me, all those experience I had as a young player, let me overcome all that as an adult. And
definitely. And I think that what happens is it teaches you how to deal with defeat. Kids got to learn that, losing, being on the short end, trying hard and not really getting your, those are important lessons to deal with adversity that way.
Without parents intervening, too. That's a big thing.
Yeah.
Right. Without parents stepping in and saying, this and that. My dad, was, he had been a baseball player himself in the minor leagues, in the outlaw leagues back in the early 50s. He played Army ball, and he was a really good high school baseball player. And, he knew as much about this stuff as any of the coaches I played for, but he never intervened. He never got involved in my sports career because he knew that he had a broader outlook. He knew that that sports would be a teacher in a larger way than just what was happening that day.
Yeah, our parents never came. Like, they would come to some of the Little League games that were organized because you needed a ride to get there. But when we were playing in the backyard at home or in the basketball courts, there were no parents. You figured out fouls. You figured out if somebody got in a fight, like, hey, okay, it's over. Let's keep playing, things like that.
Isn't that true? You worked out fouls, who did what. It was great. You learned the art of negotiation, right?
Right.
You learned all these things you weren't aware of at the time, so.
Now, because your dad was a writer focusing a lot on boxing, were you a boxing fan as a kid?
Yeah, well, sure. I watched the fights on Saturday afternoon on ABC. They were carrying a lot of fights in the late 60s. That was the first time I saw Joe Frazier fight, which was, in one of those events. And then, I was a huge Ali fan. All the kids in my middle school that I went to, they were all Joe Frazier fans because it was a suburban school in Baltimore, and they were Frazier fans because their parents hated Ali so much. So they hated Ali because of the draft and a lot of his outspoken comments. But I was the only Ali fan. So everybody was leaning on me at that time.
How old were you when the first boxing event you went to?
Well, the first fight was. I was 17. I was 17, and my father brought me to New York as kind of an end of the school holiday to see Joe Frazier against Jerry Quarry, the second fight that they had in June of 1974. So Dad brought me up, and he got me a ticket, and he was covering the fight for the magazine. So I watched the fight. It was an unbelievable fight. Joe tore Quarry apart, and Joe Louis was the referee, and he wouldn't stop the fight for some other reasons, and the writers and everybody's screaming from ringside, "Stop it, Joe! Stop it!" Finally, he did, and so Dad, went back to the magazine the next day and wrote his piece. So I sat in the corner reading a paper while he was writing, and so I really got the sense of thing. But it was in the context of that whole week. He had me up for the whole week, and we had these big dinners at Gallagher's, and I really got a sense of what the sports writer's life was like, and it was really glamorous to me. This idea that people knew who he was. He sort of came and went as he pleased, and of course he never had credit cards, so he's always had a big roll of bills in his pocket, and it was always they used to call it whip out, where he would just be duking waiters and bartenders and things. I mean, it was like a whole Runyon-esque kind of life that he exposed me to. And I said, well, that's where my real education began.
Right. Yeah, my dad was a mill guy in Pittsburgh here, and I got a different kind of education from him. Like certain words, that I learned at a very young age, and I can't say on the podcast, but
right.
You learn so much from your parents that you don't even realize, and now I find myself doing a lot of that same stuff.
Well, that's right. They sort of layer into you a lot of the things, but you pick and choose what you take and what you use. But as you get older, you realize that you were given a lot of tools to work with, and the question is, do you recognize that and work with them?
So, do you still do the whip out today?
No, I'm not a bad tipper, but I'm not like that. I don't carry around, $2,000 worth of bills in my pocket. So I'll tell you a funny story. My dad was a columnist at the Baltimore Sun back in '59 to '63, and they were a cheap outfit and really didn't pay anything. I think he was making about $75 a week, and so he gets this job at Sports Illustrated, and the first assignment, they want to send him to Saskatoon to do a profile of Gordie Howe.
Right.
And so at that time, Sports Illustrated had a pay window and papers had that too, where an editor would sign a voucher and send you up to get some money for your trip, some cash. They gave you an air travel card, but you also had to get advance money in cash. And so he goes up to the window, and the lady behind it said, well, how much do you need? And Dad said, oh, I don't know. I'm going to Saskatoon. I guess I'll need about 200. And the lady said, you'll need at least 2,000, and started peeling off these bills. And I said, he was ruined at that moment.
Oh, he got the whip out put on him. Like, hey, there you go.
He was ruined at that moment. But they were generous with expenses. They couldn't pay you a lot of money at that time, but they were real generous with expenses, and they expected you to kind of build your life around your expense account in a lot of ways.
Mark, do you remember the first sporting event you wrote about, maybe in high school or whenever that would have been? Oh,
boy. Well, that was with the Baltimore News American. Well, I went to Maryland, University of Maryland. I guess I did some things there for the college paper, but professionally, it was probably, I can remember. I was with the Baltimore News American, and I covered the Patriots against the Bills, and I was totally out of in an NFL locker room. I had no idea what to do, where to go, what to ask. I mean, I was just really So I remember vividly. I go up to Joe DeLamelore, right, for the Bills, and he just shakes his head and says, "Jimmy Olsen." Oh great! I'd heard he was a good guy. Boy, he just let me. He didn't he was a little rough with me. But you know what? I was not ready for prime time. I wasn't even ready for, I just wasn't ready. But you know what? You learn as you go.
Yeah, there's no script for that.
But going into college, like, did you write for your high school paper, or did you?
No. I played some ball, and I was kind of shy and kind of backward, and I really didn't have any writing ability at all. I mean, I was very slow. I was a poor reader, so I stayed with it. You trial and error. That's what it's about. You teach yourself one word at a time,
What did you major in college?
American Studies. But I didn't finish at Maryland. I only went for 2 years.
Okay.
I was able to get a job. I was involved with the old Washington Star. I did a lot of freelance work with them, and I happened to do an article that with another guy that got a lot of attention, and I ended up getting a credentialed enough to get a job at the News American for like $212 a week, and so that sort of got me going.
That'll get you. So, did you only write about sports, or did you take on the news and other things?
At first, I tried the news, but sports was much more interesting to me because you could touch on the same subjects that you do in news in sports, but you had much more of a latitude to be able to write with flair, and the people were interesting, and the stakes were high, and the drama, the whole thing about sports really kind of drew me in. On the news side, you're going to council meetings, and some guy, I don't know, has got a bad case of crabgrass growing, and you got to go out and do a feature on that. I don't know. Not that these aren't important stories, but for a young guy, I like being around the action, right?
Right. No, I totally understand. So, who was your first really intense interview?
Boy, intense. Oh man.
Besides Joe DeLamielleure staring you down.
Oh no, that wasn't intense. That was more humiliating. If you happen to see him around, tell him thanks for me.
I will. I do see him at the Super Bowl every now and then.
No, I don't know. It's hard to remember. I don't know. When I got into longer feature writing, all the stories were kind of intense interviews. Especially when people found themselves in sort of difficult situations in their career. I'll give you an example. I went from Baltimore onto the Detroit Free Press, and one of the stories back in '84, I guess it was, or '83, there was a relief pitcher who couldn't find the strike zone anymore. He was a popular guy named Rick Chaussee.
Right.
I don't know if you remember that name, but he was kind of driven out of baseball because he couldn't throw the ball over the plate. So I went down and spent some time with him and his family, and we talked about that whole thing. And that's the kind of intense, in-depth, probing kind of story that I would do. So I came back and wrote like 4,000 words on what happens to a man when this sort of thing happens. So I tried to look for stories that were in the margins of sports, that sort of were away from the huddle, if you will.
Right.
Just give a sense of really what's going on with these guys.
So at what point did you had a long career at the Philadelphia Daily News?
Right.
Was that after this then? Is that when you started that job?
Yeah, I started at the Daily News in '87. I came down from Detroit, and we made our home outside of Philadelphia for that period of time. It was a tabloid, but it was a tabloid that not like the tabloids that you think of. They had a lot of it was a great sports section. I don't know if you remember it, Gus, but we had really good writers, columnists, long features. I mean, we had deep page counts. We had a lot of expense money. So we really tried to cover it in a major way. So it was a good home. I learned a lot there. In fact, I learned all of the skills that I needed to later write several books, So it was a good place to be.
So when you were back to Detroit real quick, I have a good friend of mine who you might have covered when he played for the Lions, Eric Hipple.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah, Eric, yeah.
So Eric, go ahead.
I did a feature a week in the life of Eric Hipple, and which I did. I would check in with him every day and talk. It was kind of a diary fashion.
Yeah.
And it was the day after Wilbur Marshall had just. I don't know whether you remember this hit.
Oh, I've seen it.
Yeah, at Chicago Stadium, and Marshall just flattened him. And so I caught up with him the next morning. So that was kind of like we kicked us off. But he was in pain, man. I'll tell you.
Yeah, he's tough. And what a great guy. What a great guy.
Yeah, he was a nice guy.
Yeah, Eric Hipple was a great guy.
What was the generally the relationship with the Philadelphia athletes and the reporters in Philadelphia? What was the dynamic there?
Well, it's not the well. Let me put it to you this way. It's fraught, a lot of times. A lot of, probably not so different than Washington, though, right, Gus? I mean, there's tension, right, between the writers and the players. I think that's very true in Philly. I think it used to be a lot more fraught than it is now. But one thing I will say about the Philly writers and the papers, when I was going back and doing the Joe Frazier biography, I was absolutely astonished and pleased by, when I looked at the papers from the 60s and the 70s, how good the writing was, how deep and in-depth it was. I mean, every day, people like Stan Hochman and Larry Merchant and Tom Cushman and many others, they really just sort of, it was like an ongoing history that they were writing. And I read that and absorbed that, and it sort of found its way into my book. I wonder today if 20 years from now, somebody were to sit down and try to write a biography of Bryce Harper, what they would have to draw on. Right. I mean, there's just none of that. I mean, in Philly, in Joe Frazier, you didn't have to make an appointment to see Joe Frazier. You just walked down North Broad Street, and knocked on his door. Right. He was there at the gym.
He's there at the gym.
He was there at the gym. Come on in. They were all like that then. I mean, it began to change, of course, as the money got greater. But, accessibility that you had was great.
Right.
And in Philly, I mean, I think that there's a good deal of respect between the writers and players in a lot of respect. I mean, we have a guy in town named Ray Didinger who's been around forever. I don't think there's a writer in town who's more respected than he is by the players and by everybody, and he's been tough. So,
But what is your relationship that you had when you were in Philly with the fans? Because Philly fans, they're not fanatics for no reason.
Right.
They're a little intense.
I bet you could tell a few stories about playing in Philly.
Well, I played there in the playoffs one year with the Vikings, and all my family were going in with all their Viking shirts on. And I said, guys, you might not want to do that. I know this place a little bit. You might want to just go in wearing a normal, maybe a hat or whatever. And I remember Dante Culpepper's mom. She had his jersey on and purple this and purple that all over. She literally had food and beer thrown on her in the stands, and they had to escort her out. And we lost the game, but it was it can get very intense. They don't have a jail there for.
It's
nothing.
Terrible, and it's terrible. And if you're a player that's sort of off his game for a season or whatever, it's brutal. I remember talking to Lance Parrish, the old catcher, when he came to Philly. He hated it. He hated the fans in Philly, and the ball and everything about it. And I know writers who came to town who really didn't like it too much either. It doesn't warm its heart to outsiders, right?
Right.
There's a them and us attitude about it. Very territorial. And I've seen it myself, people wearing Giants jerseys or any other team jersey. And, you've seen events where people get beaten up in the streets and what have you. But I have to say, and I'm not saying this in defense of Philadelphia, but we're seeing it around the country, aren't we? I mean, in other cities and outside of Dodger Stadium and various other places, fans have gotten really, really crazy. Now, I sort of flew under the radar until I started appearing on television.
Yeah.
And then I would, was on Daily News Live for about 10 years, and people still recognize me, and I haven't been on the air in 10 years. But, I'd be standing at a urinal at the ballpark, and the guy would recognize me, and he'd say, "You are a funny man." I said, "Thanks for letting me know." But I don't know. It's not everybody. It's some fans, and it's always been some fans, in my view.
Did you have a favorite Philadelphia athlete that you really enjoyed interviewing or speaking with?
Oh boy, geez, I'll probably forget. As far as Philly, I mean, many of them were very much professional about the job. Of course, Eric Lindros. I once interviewed him while he was reading the paper. So I'm there asking him questions. He's got the paper up. Scheduled interview. I didn't like that too much.
Yeah, that wouldn't be it's pretty disrespectful.
Well, I would say so, and kind of passive-aggressive in a way. But I know Magic Johnson. I went out when I was in Detroit, kind of went out in the cold and to see him. I was set up, but I had no idea what would happen when I got out there. He had me there for about 3 days, taking me around. He couldn't have been more of a gentleman. I mean, and more interested in making my experience with him to be the most it could be. And that is the attitude I think athletes should have about this stuff, is that it may not work out well. There might be some errors in the stories, but, give it the attention it deserves if you're going to do it at all, basically. And Joe Frazier was like that. He was a very much, what do you need? How can I help you? So the athletes that were like that were always the ones that we got along famously that way. But, I think that athletes have a very much, they're under pressure and they're wary. There's a lot of things going on that would kind of preclude people from getting together and putting together a good interview kind of thing.
Yeah, no, it is difficult because I think with social media nowadays, it has really changed how you get to tell the story of that athlete, because that story is told every day immediately.
Oh, yes, absolutely. But I predate social media, believe it or not. I mean, I'm not. I'm starting to feel like Methuselah here, but I was, when I was doing it, I mean, it was the paper every day and the internet, I guess. But it's nothing like it is now. It's all going crazy now, and so you're getting a shallower version of the story that's repeated over and over and over again. You're not getting any kind of explanation in depth. It's like just when you're kind of getting interested in the in the subject, the story gets cut off. It gets mangled by people who take it and print it elsewhere. It's a tough situation that way. So it's not the same as it was, for sure.
Well, I think back to when you said about the in-depth writing, and to hear that story of that player, that team. But now somebody writes something about that player, that team, and then all of a sudden there's an opposite view coming right away. And so you're hearing all these different things. But back in the day, you would just hear, like, growing up in Pittsburgh, we heard so much about the life of Roberto Clemente, and then going through the 70s of We Are Family, and then the Steelers, and it was just all felt like such good stuff.
Yeah.
And now it's like, okay, this guy did this and this guy did that.
Yeah.
And
Well,
It
it's
seems
all
very
driven.
tough.
It's all driven by clicks now, right? So you put out there, ice cream causes cancer. Clicks, clicks, clicks. Who's going to click on that? Or if you put in there, ice cream tastes good, nobody's going to click on it. It's trying to be provocative. It's trying to be a needler. It's not journalism by any stretch of the imagination, as I understand journalism to be. But it's all about, in newsrooms today, you have boards that show which stories are getting the most clicks, what the most attention. That is no way to put out responsible journalism, in my view. It really isn't, because it drives reporters to reach for that apple on the tree instead of another apple on the tree, Right. So I really think it's a bad, the way it's evolved is not healthy.
So how do you feel? Like you wrote this great book about Joe Frazier. So how do you feel that you can connect with the audience today by writing a book compared to, like you said, all the clicks? Because this is going to be an in-depth understanding of Joe Frazier. And you got to get those people to want to read it. And like you said, today is about clicks and how many, So how did you kind of go through that to get your audience to really want to read this?
Well, it's an interesting question you ask. It's one that I grapple with all the time. I mean, I really don't have an understanding of the reading habits of folks in their 20s and 30s. I think the book will be most attractive to readers of the remaining readers of the old Sports Illustrated days. People in their 70s, 60s, 50s, maybe 40s who have a memory of the two fighters. And Joe touched a lot of lives, so people that his life had touched, I think, will buy the book. Europe, I think the book will do quite well over there. They have more of an interest in boxing over there, and maybe Australia and so forth. But you're right. I mean, it's definitely a generational divide that you have to deal with, and publishers are no different than anyone else. They want to appeal to the widest audience they can. So it wasn't necessarily an easy sale to get this book published in the first place. So, but I'm glad I pursued it. I'm glad I did it. I think it's worthwhile. I think it preserves in time a piece of history that we'll never see again, and two athletes that we'll never see again.
What's your opinion on the reason for the declining popularity in boxing? Like you mentioned earlier, watching Sundays on ABC, I thought that was phenomenal. I mean, that was such an enjoyable experience.
Right, it was Wide World of Sports.
Wide World of Sports, and that's no longer around. And is it UFC and MMA and all that, or what's
that's part? Yeah, that's part of it. That's part of it. You see a fragmentation to other and a dispersal to other sports. Basketball. Look at the big bodies that are in basketball, and of course football. I mean, at another point in time, they might have migrated to boxing. So I think there's a lot of factors involved. And it's like back in the 50s and 60s, on Sunday morning, you'd see a big picture of the last race at Pimlico or Bowie on the sports section, a horse picture, and then you'd have all the horse racing coverage, and then you'd have boxing coverage. You don't have any of that anymore. That's all gone. So times have really changed that way. Boxing is a sport. It's from another time. It's from a kind of a golden age, and I don't think it will ever be what it was. Joe Frazier came up in the golden age of sports, boxing. And I think one of the reasons that we connected with him was because he was on the smallish side and he was kind of an overachiever, but he never backed up an inch. I mean, think about the people we admire in sports. They're the ones that never back up an inch, even when the going gets as tough as it can be. And it certainly did with Ali in those fights.
Well, I think also there's less personality, maybe also, especially in like the heavyweight area. Like it reminds me, and this may be a stretch, but it reminds me kind of the decline in the popularity of tennis, maybe men's tennis. There used to be a lot of personalities that were fun to follow, and that it kind of reminds me that was very popular in the 80s, as was boxing, and that seems to those personalities declined. The boxing personalities seem to have declined. I mean, it's less interesting. I don't know.
Yeah, tennis is an interesting analogy because you had athletes who were not just great athletes, but they were vocal, they were flamboyant. You know, Connors, McEnroe, that whole bunch. And with Ali, you know, he dragged boxing out of the gray days of the 50s, you know, the Marciano days, where the Dems and Does days, and really made an articulated. I mean, he gave articulation to the sport. You know, he was something that had never been seen before, and now we've seen him again and again and again and again and again across all sports. He sort of got it all going as far as the loud, brash kind of athlete. I was going to ask you, Gus, who do you think would be a better teammate in the locker room, Ali or Frazier?
You know, that's very interesting because I've actually played with kind of guys that have both those personalities, right? Guys that are loud and you hear them all the time, but when you're around them in the locker room, they're completely different. Like everybody wants to talk about Randy Moss. You know, to me, he reminded me a little bit of Ali as far as when he would go out and do things in public and everybody talked about him, it's bad and this, but in the locker room, the guys loved him, right? Because he wanted to be a part of the team, but he also was this big figure. And I bet if we ever interview Randy and go back and ask him some questions, he'll say, if I go back and tell Randy one thing, it was just to like be more accepting of a lot of stuff that happened in his life instead of shunning everybody. And Ali was like, he was this big figure, and he had these qualities that really said, he made himself way bigger than everybody else. But I bet if you sat with him, he would take the time with you and wanted to talk to you and have you understand who he was. And Joe Frazier, he's that quiet type that I've played with so many guys that you want to follow, that you want to go into battle with because, like you said, they weren't ever going to quit.
I was thinking that Ali, perfect wide receiver, Joe would be a perfect fullback, right?
Right.
Kind of. Yeah. Well, Ali, it's interesting that you say that about Moss because Ali, once you got him away from the cameras and the crowds, he was very kind of quiet, introverted. He was nothing like you saw in public.
Right.
It was a 180 from what you saw in public. He had this ability to get in front of a crowd and to sort of understand what got them going. And unfortunately, he soon realized that what got the crowd going was when he started this racial baiting of Frazier, calling him an Uncle Tom, calling him ugly, and worse, and all this stuff. Fans that would sort of sit there on their hands, sort of listening to his sort of charming chatter, would just sort of explode in frenzy when he got really mean and angry that way. And it tells us a little about the nature of crowds and what gets them going, kind of the raw meat that you throw at them. And he threw the raw meat. And I think it was maybe to his regret later in life. I think that it probably was. But at the time, Ali was all about putting fannies in the seats, all about getting the attention, you know. And Joe just didn't understand that because to Joe, boxers outside the ring, inside the ring, they were tearing each other's heads off. Outside the ring, there was a fraternity among boxers.
Right.
You treated each other with respect. Guy needs a hand, you give him a hand. Ali was outside the ring, he was pulling all this malarkey, you know. So it was kind of an interesting relationship.
Well, early on, they were pretty good friends, weren't they?
Well, they were
or maybe more respectful of each other.
Well, kind of in the fraternity, right?
Yeah,
As you would be fraternity. They both saw in each other the potential for a money-making proposition. As I say in the book, Ali looked at Frazier back in the 60s, late 60s, when he was on exile. He looked at Frazier and he said he saw $10 million. Well, that's how Ali thought of those things. And Ali was determined to get them together, and that Joe was. He could see that. But they weren't blood brothers that way, I don't think. I wouldn't say that. I don't think Joe trusted him. I think Joe was wary of him. I think Ali, in fact, during his exile, moved to Philly, and I think in 1970, and it was always showing up wherever Joe had an appearance in town, pestering him, needling him. It got to the point where one time at the Academy of Music in Philly, Joe was doing a gig with the Knockouts one Sunday morning, and he was getting his instruments out of the trunk of his car, and here comes Ali around the corner leading a parade of 50 people. He spots Frazier and he says, Joe Frazier, screaming at the top of his lungs. And the guys that were with Joe that day, they both confirmed this. Joe reached for a tire iron and said, I'm going to finish this guy right now.
Wow.
And they had to drag him inside the academy. Now, I don't think Joe would have hit him, but that's how, as one of his pals told me, he said, Joe was sweating bullets that day. He was sweating bullets. That was the kind of frenzy. So by the time they met in the ring on March 8th, nobody was going to beat Frazier that night. Not Ali, not Jack Dempsey, not Jack Johnson, not Marciano, nobody. Lewis, forget it. He was going to that was going to be it. But that was the top of the mountain, right? Even if he didn't know it at the time, he was at the top of the mountain. Then it was a long slide down.
Yeah, well, it is hard because you're not going to stay at the top of the mountain for long.
Well,
and you try and you try. I mean, I was lucky to play 15 years. How many years did Joe end up boxing total?
65, he turned pro, and he was done in 77.
Yeah, that's a long time for boxing. It's a lot of It's a lot of shots to the head and everything else.
Well, yeah, he's really lucky he survived the gyms in Philadelphia. A lot of guys don't even survive that kind of the fights inside the gym, the sparring sessions. In Philly, my old colleague Stan Hochman said Philly gym wars shorten more careers than cocaine. And it's true. I mean, guys would get together in these sparring sessions and tear each other's heads off. People would line up around the ring. They'd take bets. They'd, all these things. It was like to be the king of the gym, right? Was more important than actually winning on fight night in a lot of ways. But Joe was able to manage that, and he was handled beautifully by his managers and trainer Yank Durham and Eddie Futch. If you look at Joe's record, they only exposed him after a certain point, 2 fights a year at most. They didn't, and Ali was in the ring 5-6 times a year, taking a lot of punishment. And Ali took a lot of punishment in the gym too. Let's not forget that.
Oh, absolutely. Well, what's the feeling on Frazier's legacy in the Philadelphia area? Like around here, I think Roberto Clemente's mentioned every day. I mean, by somebody on the radio or in passing or whatever. Is it similar with Frazier?
Yeah. Oh, I think so. He's beloved, and it's an interesting thought. He had a complicated life. His warts were sort of out there in public, but it didn't seem to matter to people too much. He was a generous man. One of the things that I found so interesting was how, he could be driving down the highway with somebody and spot a car stranded on the side of the road. And all of a sudden he's pulling over to the side of the road and he gets out of his car and he's looking under the hood. He's got his jack in his hand. He's changing the tire. Meanwhile, the person who's the driver's the heavyweight champ's changing my tire. He's like a one-man AAA, right? And he would walk around, or he'd be in Philly. There's another story where he's driving to Atlantic City. He hadn't left Philly yet. He comes to legless man crossing the street with a can of kerosene on a cold December day, and and Joe pulls the limousine over to the side of the road, gets out in his fur coat and his cowboy hat, helps the guy into the limo, drives him home, takes him inside, reaches into his pocket, got a roll of bills in he called it the love. He said, "You look like you could use some love." And he pulls out, and it's right before Christmas, he gives him $200. I mean, this is the kind of thing nobody ever heard of or saw. And it's interesting, Ali was the same way. They were generous people and good guys. But Joe was that way. Joe would do, if you need something, he would do it for you. He didn't like getting pushed around. He was a man with pride. But if you treated him good, he treated you better.
What do you think a Joe Frazier would go back and tell a young Joe Frazier to be ready for or look out for?
Oh, boy, that's an interesting question. That's hard to say. I think maybe he would have been, kept his cool with Ali a bit more. I think it might have been if he kept his cool. He liked the party life. Maybe he would have done a little less of that. He might have been more less restless when it came to his own family. I mean, he tripped the light fantastic. He was, as his daughter told me, he was a rolling stone.
Yeah.
And that catches up with you, and so maybe some stuff in that area. Who knows? Who knows when people reach the end of the life, what they, how they might have done it differently.
Right. So if our fans, we're going to try and show them this, and if you could tell them one thing why they should read this book and what they're going to get out of it, what would it be?
Wow, that's an essay question. Okay. It's my life's work, and I think that it gives a full-bodied portrait of the way it was. As I said earlier, in a time that will be no more. It's a golden age of sports. I think you can learn a lot from reading about Joe's journey in life, even outside of boxing. I mean, he grew up in the poorest county of the country in Beaufort, South Carolina, amid disease and malnutrition. Took the bus to New York and ended up in the gyms, and just his whole journey through Jim Crow and what he made of himself. I think it's inspiring, and I think that you'll find yourself absorbed by his story in a way that you will find unexpected.
No, and my last question before we get to our last segment is, what would Mark Kram Sr., I'm sure, very proud?
I think he would be. He had written a book before his death in 2001. It came out called Ghost of Manila, which was the fateful blood feud between Joe Frazier, or Ali and Frazier. But that was more of an essayistic approach to the two figures in their three fights. And, my book is more layered with reporting. He would have been proud. I'll tell you why, because I learned an awful lot from him. I couldn't have had a better teacher. I mean, as I was writing the book, I thought back to so many things, kind of batting tips, if you will, that he had sort of given me as sort of things to keep in mind, that if you weren't the son of a writer, you'd really never have access to.
Right.
So I think he would look upon this book as a testament to our life together as father and son.
That's wonderful.
Who was your dad's favorite boxer?
Oh. Well, he wasn't a fan, if you will. He wasn't one of the guys that would sort of he was more restrained in his affections when it came to athletes and performance. He looked at sports as like a kind of a stage play, and he didn't. He wasn't the sort you'd see typically in a locker room after a game, but he admired Ali tremendously. Although Ghost of Manila reflected, he caught a lot of criticism because he was too harsh about Ali. But the truth of the matter is, he had a great deal of affection for Ali, the athlete. What he didn't seem to grasp was he didn't understand this notion that Ali was this Martin Luther King figure and what have you. That seemed to be beyond Dad's. He just didn't get that. Now, a lot of people argued that point with him vociferously, but he liked Ali. He liked Joe quite a bit. And there were a lot of unknown fighters that he covered over the years that he had some admiration for. He was always a guy that sort of like the underdog, the guy that sort of had things arrayed against him. So he got to know them pretty well. That's how he was. He was an absolute underdog. He was 10th from the bottom of his class in high school. Didn't go to college. Started out working in factories and on road crews. But he taught himself to write just by reading and reading and reading and reading and reading. And by hook or crook, he got where he was going.
That's awesome. Wow, that's not your typical path to being a famous SI writer.
Yeah, I mean, that's
wow.
right. Oh,
who would have guessed that?
No, that's right. I should have mentioned that. He was really he was a late bloomer, and he was self-taught. Totally self-taught.
You would never guess that for somebody of his stature that he was self-taught. That's incredible.
Oh gosh, yes. And I don't. There's just so much you can learn in a classroom. But Dad knew the streets, and he knew sports really well, and he knew athletes really well. So he had a gift.
The sad part about maybe his story today is it might not have ever happened. Because of the resume, wouldn't have been what they're looking for, and it wouldn't.
Yeah, it's really sad. So many people with potential are being shut out. Like I said, I didn't finish college. I was really kind of I struggled. I'm sure that they would have. For that very job I got in Baltimore, they probably have 300 resumes for it, and with master's degrees. I'd be doing something else in life, which probably might not have been a bad choice, actually. I like to work with my hands and things. I could have been a carpenter or something else. You don't have to be a writer, but writers find their way into the profession in whatever way they can. All talent always finds its way, and
that's true.
And it's in sports too. Dad always thought during the tough times, and he had some really tough times in the '80s. He lived in Washington actually at that time, and he always had this dream that he said, "I wish I should have stayed in baseball and become a third base coach." Something that's kind of part of a team, and you sort of know how you did at the end of each day. That you look at the box score, and it's all there, but you get a chance to start anew the next day.
Right.
And he loved that about. He loved how you could wipe away yesterday's performance with a new chance today.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. When you have a bad game, you can't wait till the next game, right? Because you got to hear about it all week from your coaches, from the media, and everybody. You can't wait to get back out there on Sunday and go and try to prove yourself again.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the great things about sports.
Do you still follow the Orioles pretty intently?
Well, I can't do it too intently because they're so awful.
We're going through the same.
You're
thing.
talking to Pirate fans here, so
yeah. It's difficult, I think they traded too much last year when they cleaned house. They're unwatchable. They're a Double-A team, charging AAA prices, or I mean, Major League prices. I mean, I took my daughter to the Dodgers and the Phillies a couple of weeks ago. It cost us a fortune. I could do that once a year, maybe.
Yeah.
You know,
I really don't know how fans go every game.
Oh my God! I mean, really.
It's a whole different game now.
Well, where does this end? Do you think, Gus? Where do you think this tops out at? I mean, every economic kind of vehicle has its top. Where's the top with all this?
Well, I don't know, because we just interviewed Lee Steinberg, and we were talking about the same thing, and he said, I asked him how these players, how he knew what their value was. He said, well, the first thing I had to do was go and tell the owners what their value was. And we had to increase contracts. We had to increase TV contracts and bring the owners more money to show them, the owners, how much they can make. Then it correlates to the players. So if the owners are going to continue to make a lot of money, the players and the unions are going to continue to ask for more money. So I don't know until the fans stop going. Because in Pittsburgh, we're averaging 15,000 a game. That's like, I don't know how you sustain that.
It's almost becoming a studio sport in a lot of ways, you know? Like, we'll play the games and just run the cameras, and you'll watch it on television. And because I'd be somebody who would go to the Phillies, you know, it's 15 minutes from my house, the ballpark, 20 minutes, and I'd be there 15, 20 times a year, but I can't afford that. It's ridiculous.
Well, yeah, you go to a game, you have nachos and a beer, and you're like, I'm out $150. It's crazy.
Right. Exactly. So I don't know. Are they killing the golden goose? I think the players should get everything they can get. I really do.
I'm
just wondering where the structure, where this whole thing, not just the players, but the whole thing tops out at.
But I also think that for a few players to make a lot of money, it means your team is not as good, because then you're not able to pay the rest of the team what their value is, because you've put it all into a couple of people, just like the whole quarterback situation now. You pay the top quarterback a lot of money, but then if he gets hurt, the next guy comes in and he's not worth the same value, and so they don't pay him as much, and they don't have equal talent. If your team isn't now, if you lose your quarterback or any backup on the field, your team is not going to win. There's no doubt about it.
Let me ask you this from a player's perspective. You'd have an interested perspective on this. Do you get the same performance from a player after you've given him his big payday?
I've always wondered that, because I think there's a difference in some guys, definitely. I don't think it's the same with every player, because for me, when I was able to get some contracts, it was I have to go out and prove my worth, that I am worth what they paid me. Now, other guys may not see it the same. I think that in football, our contracts aren't guaranteed except for the signing bonus. So you have to go out and prove. My favorite year is when I played for the Dolphins and I played under an incentive-based contract. So I had all these incentives, and to make my worth, I had to acquire all these, they were hard to reach, but I reached them and I was able to make the money. I really like that because, that keeps you involved in it. And if you're just going to pay a guy, no matter if he hits 150, right, and he has, 45 errors that year, he's still going to make $35 million. To me, that's crazy.
I was just thinking of this 13-year Bryce Harper contract, $330 million, and how are they going to get his value? I mean, I just don't understand how he's going to. I mean, right now he's hitting about 250, and he's got 20 home runs or something like that. The truth is, I mean, wouldn't he reach his potential more and be a better player if he had that incentive every for playing for contracts, playing for his money?
Well, I don't think that the whole contract year myth is not a myth. I think if you looked at the science behind it, there's a lot of guys that really perform when they've got a year left, and then you're going to see a dip.
Oh yeah,
I don't think that's just made up.
To me, because I am a Pirate fan and I know him because I coached his sons in football in St. Louis, was Andy Van Slyke.
Oh,
that happened to him here in Pittsburgh. Remember, he had a great year and then he got his big contract, and it was and then he went left and went to St. Louis, right?
Right.
And it just to me, that was one of the guys I always remember that happening to.
Well, also
It's
Jason Kendall, too. I don't know if you remember the catcher, Jason Kendall.
Sure.
The Pirates paid him at the time, which is still the biggest contract in Pirates history. Sadly, is $60 million, but in the Pirates world, that's $400 million. Ever since he got that contract, he was not nearly the Jason Kendall from before that contract.
Well, I don't have much sympathy for the Pirates. They took us out in 71 and 79, and I just...
I wasn't going to bring that up. But.
We should have beaten you both. We should have won both those years. Thanks, Earl Weaver.
All right, Mark, our last segment we do is called No Huddle. We pepper some questions at you. You can answer them quick if you want. Take your time, whatever. But Dave always starts us, so it's our 2-minute drill. And we try to have a lot of fun with it. Go ahead, Dave.
Okay.
All right. This is kind of a generic boxing question, but who's the greatest pound-for-pound boxer ever?
Sugar Ray Robinson.
Nice. And if we ask this is one we ask for every guest. What is your biggest pet peeve?
Leaf blowers.
I love my leaf blower.
Early Sunday morning, though, I'm never a big fan.
Absolutely crazy.
Yeah, like at 8 a.m. on a Sunday morning, it's like...
Come out. Yeah, but it's not just one of them anymore. It's whole SWAT teams.
Yeah, right. It's like a symphony of leaf blowers that's going on. If you could be one person in history or sports for one day, who would that be?
Oh, man. Babe Ruth.
Ooh.
It's hard to argue that one.
It's hard to argue that one.
Wouldn't it be great to look at the world through Babe Ruth's eyes for a day? I mean, that must be amazing. I mean,
it would be. I think that would be pretty incredible to see, and just to be like, you hear about the stories about him holding the bat, and how big it was, and like,
right.
I mean, I played baseball when I was young and quit after I went to college, but just that would have been an incredible experience to be Babe Ruth.
And he had such a sharp, sweet swing. You ever see the video of his swings?
Beautiful swing.
All right, we should show that to some of the Pirates, maybe.
Whatever would help. I think I'd be Joe Namath about an hour after the Super Bowl. That would have been that would have been probably a good time. What's the biggest difference in boxing today than 50 years ago?
Well, 50 years ago, they used to have what's called the championship rounds, which were rounds in championship fights between 13, 14, and 15. And as you know, with the Ali Frazier fights, those were incredibly dramatic rounds. Now fights are settled in 12 rounds. That's the rule. I see why they've been trying to. It really tries to reduce the damage fighters, and I'm all for that. But as far as pure drama inside the ring, those last 3 rounds were often decisive.
All right, if you could change one thing in sports today, what would it be?
Sports or just baseball?
Just baseball.
Well, I'll tell you what. I am so sick of watching managers pull pitchers after 5 innings. My eyes are falling out of my head. The announcers started on inning 3, the 3rd inning. They said, well, he's up to 42 pitches. We have activity in the bullpen. 5th inning. Are we going to pull him? Oh, he's going to pull him. And then we go through 4 relief pitchers, and the game gets totally out of hand. Jim Palmer used to complete 28 games. And my wife said, well, maybe he would have had a longer career if he pitched less. I said, he won 20 games 8 times and won 3 Cy Young Awards. How much do you want to squeeze the lemon?
Like Dave, one of my favorite stats is Nolan Ryan pitched 230 pitches one game.
Yeah, 242.
Yeah.
242 or something, one game.
Right. And Spahn and Marichal hooked up in a 0-0 15-inning, 16-inning game.
Right.
Why can't these guys today go more than 5 innings? What in the world is happening? I'll tell you, the old Oriole teams, George Bamberger was the pitching coach. He believed that the more you threw, the more the stronger your arm was.
Oh,
and
yeah, no
it's
doubt.
true. It's really true. I mean,
How many
guys,
more injuries do you see today?
Yeah, all these injuries and I don't get it too. I once did a story when I was with the Daily News on Dr. Andrews down in was it Alabama, and
Right.
does all the
Health South, yes.
yeah, the Tommy John surgeries, and he had patients coming in and out of his operating theater just like it's a train station. It was unbelievable. He told me that once he did 24 of them in one day at one time, 4 different theaters in the area. So I don't know. Is it the amateur level, or are they getting overused at the amateur level? But the point is that these guys today, it's really diminished the game in my view. And I guess you have the variation of it in other sports too, where there's this whittling down of achievement and performance. But I'll tell you, it's a turnoff for me watching the game. I don't want to see your 4th best pitcher come in. I want to see there's the authorship of games. Starting pitchers had an authorship of the game.
I love
they
that
get
word.
The 7th, 8th, 9th inning. I mean, boy, when the going gets tough, let's see a little of that.
Well, one more stat along those lines. I saw the other day that I think it was the 1980 Oakland A's had more complete games than all of Major League Baseball combined last year. It's a good illustration right there.
And who came up with the 100 pitch count? Like that's
why 100?
I don't get that. If I were writing today, that's something I would write about. Try to get to the bottom of that. I mean, that's so arbitrary, right? And you're not going to see another 300 game winner. You're not going to see it.
No.
You're not going to see. In 2021, you're going to have the 50th anniversary of the 4 Oriole 20 game winners that year in 1971. You're not going to see teams with 2 20 game winners.
No.
I mean,
not anymore.
They've denied starting pitchers their chance at greatness. They really have. It's really a sad byproduct of this sabermetrics era, which is total crap.
Right.
That's my pet peeve is
Yeah.
sabermetrics.
You love the exit velocity, though.
Oh my God, the launch angle, like
The launch angle.
Yeah.
Boy, thanks for telling us that. Like,
Yeah.
All right, now we asked you this question if you were Joe Frazier, but as Mark Kram, if you could go back in time and tell young Mark Kram something, what would that be?
It would be to learn some humility at a younger age, because I think that would make me a better writer and a better person. Actually, that's something that gets overlooked.
Right, I agree.
I think that could apply to a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Quite frankly.
If I could do one thing, change one thing, it would be that. I feel like that would be the thing.
Awesome. Well, Mark, thank you for getting in the huddle with us. And
All right, it was fun.
We learned so much today, and we really appreciate it. As we go through this, we're creating a new website for our whole podcast, and we're going to be doing giveaways, and we'd love to see if we can give away a book sometime, maybe have you autograph it.
Sure,
We'll stay in touch, definitely.
Stay in touch. Anything you need, I'll be happy to do it.
Hey, I have one last question.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. In December, we're lucky enough to have Manny Pacquiao as a guest.
Oh, yeah.
Can you give us a question for Manny Pacquiao? You're a resident boxing expert.
I'll tell you, I'd have to think about it. I really would.
Okay.
I just.
We're going to connect back in a few weeks.
We're going to reconnect.
In a month or so.
Let me give it some thought. It's not my era, basically. I mean, I was so immersed in the 60s and 70s and 80s. It's just, but I'd have to think about it.
Okay.
I'm glad to do it, but let me give you something. Please.
We'll reconnect and get that from you.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Mark.
All right, guys.
Thank you.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.